Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm Selby Nimrod, Assistant Curator at the MIT List Visual Arts Center, and I am delighted to welcome you to tonight's conversation with Nayland Blake and Jamillah James, a virtual public program in conjunction with the List Center presentation of Nayland's survey exhibition, No Wrong Holes, 30 Years of Nayland Blake, that travels to the List Center from the Institute of Contemporary Art, Los Angeles, where it was organized by curator Jamillah James. While our galleries will remain closed very sadly through the end of 2020, we are happy to be able to share Nayland's work and this exhibition with you through our virtual programs, photo documentation, and interpretive materials, which are available on our website, as well as a forthcoming video interview with Nayland. But before I formally introduce our speakers, Nayland and Jamillah, I'd also like to acknowledge and extend my sincere thanks to the following organizations and colleagues whose support and diligent efforts were instrumental to realizing No Wrong Holes. We are grateful for the continued institutional support of MIT, the List Center Advisory Committee, and to members of the List Center's Directors Circle, whose membership directly funds our exhibition program. Thanks also to the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts and the City of Los Angeles Department of Cultural Affairs for their initial support of the ICA Los Angeles presentation of this exhibition. Our sincere thanks also to all of the lenders to the exhibition who generously extended the loans for at least an extra 6 months because of COVID, to Anne Elgood, the director of the ICA-LA, and the entire team there, to Henrietta Holdish, the List Center's former director of exhibitions and curator, whose idea it was to reach out to Jamillah to travel this show to the List Center, to Matthew Mark's gallery and the gallery team, many of whom are logged on tonight, to Flower Bakery and Cafe, who worked really closely with our team here and with Nayland to realize Nayland's work Feeder 2, to the List Center team, especially Campus and Public Programs Manager Emily Garner, who organized tonight's event, as well as David Siegel of MIT AV for working on this and all of our virtual programming. Of course, none of this would have been possible without Nayland Blake and Jamillah James. It has been such a privilege and an honor to work with both of them to realize the Cambridge presentation of No Wrong Holes. And it is my pleasure tonight to introduce them both to you and then hand over the floor to them. Jamillah James is curator at the Institute of Contemporary Art, Los Angeles, as well as co-curator of the 2021 edition of the New Museum Triennial. Prior to joining ICA-LA in 2016, James was assistant curator at the Hammer Museum, Los Angeles, and has held curatorial positions at the Studio Museum in Harlem and Queens Museum, New York, in addition to producing exhibitions and programs at various alternative and artist-run spaces throughout the US and Canada since 2004. Recent exhibitions include Harold Mendez, Let Us Gather in a Flourishing Way, Stanley Khan, No Go Backs, No Wrong Holes, 30 Years of Nayland Blake, of course, and This Has No Name, the first museum survey of B. Wertz. She has also curated solo exhibitions of Lucas Blaylock, Sarah Kane, Njideka Akunyili Crosby, Alex DeCorte, Abigail DeVille, Rafa Esparza, Miriam Joffrey, Anne Green Kelly, and Simone Lee, among others. Nayland Blake is an artist, writer, educator, and curator. Born in New York City in 1960, they attended Bard College and then California Institute of the Arts. After receiving their MFA, they moved to San Francisco in 1984. They've had one-person exhibitions at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, University Art Museum Berkeley, Contemporary Arts Museum Houston, and the Tang Teaching Museum at Skidmore College. And their works are in the permanent collections of the Museum of Modern Art, the Whitney Museum, Museum of Contemporary Art Los Angeles, the Brooklyn Museum, the Studio Museum in Harlem, and many others. In 1995, they were co-curator with Lawrence Rinder of the landmark exhibition In a Different Light at the University Art Museum Berkeley, the first museum exhibition to examine the impact of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and queer artists on contemporary art. In 2018, Blake organized Tag, Proposals on Queer Play and the Ways Forward for the Institute of Contemporary Art Philadelphia. They are currently the founding chair of the ICP Bard MFA program at the International Center for Photography in New York. In 2012, they were awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship Blake is represented by Matthew Marks Gallery in New York and until recently, Anglin Gilbert Gallery in San Francisco. That concludes my introductions. I should also mention that there will be time for brief Q&A at the end of the program, and you may submit questions for Nayland and Jamillah by clicking on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. So without further ado, Jamillah, Nayland, thank you. I'm gonna mute myself now.
Okay, thank you, Selby, so much for that introduction. And thanks to everyone for tuning in from various places all over the place. I'm Jamillah James, curator at the Institute of Contemporary Art, Los Angeles. I think I am sharing my screen. Yes, okay. And it is my esteemed privilege to speak with you tonight about No Wrong Holes, the exhibition that I organized with Nayland Blake. I first want to extend my thanks to the lenders and supporters of the exhibition, Corey Nomura and the whole team at Matthew Marks Gallery, and the team at the MIT List Center, especially Selby, for doing an incredible job with presenting this exhibition with incredible care and attention in the most unusual of circumstances. I would also like to acknowledge Maura Riley and Ian Barry, whose earlier presentations of Nayland's work has been foundational to the research and production of this show. And of course, to Nayland Blake, artist, educator, curator, friend, for being such a tremendous partner over the life of this project. Okay. The exhibition No Wrong Holes was presented last fall at the ICALA and was a homecoming of sorts for Nayland to California, where they spent many years both as a student and as a working artist before returning to New York, where they grew up and where they continue to live now. The exhibition is organized both chronologically, albeit loosely, and thematically in relation to moves within Nayland's work and the exploration of play in different manifestations with an increased alienation of the physical body in favor of more aspirational models of being as you move throughout the show. The first room of the exhibition included earlier works with objects suggesting intimate play and sexual interactions, the second more explicitly connecting the artist's identity and politics to the work. And the last, an articulation of the lived experience through a series of surrogates that give voice and form to a complex negotiation of the forces that impact one's lived experience, such as identity, politics, and community. Throughout the work is an exploration of the dualities and contradictions and containing all of these things and more in one body, in one object. Quoting from the Publication for Behavior, which was the 2009 exhibition of their work, Nayland says, "I have always experienced my own life in terms that are more shifting and liminal than definite. Because of that, I've looked to my own work to provide the explanations for my life rather than the other way around. My work has taught me that I think about race, why I like the kinds of sex I do, where my fears and shames are located, and my pleasures as well. I make work because I want to learn those things." Blake's extended meditation on race, their own experience as a biracial, Black and white, and also the idea of racial passing, as well as gender and sex, is channeled through an array of media and formal concerns, including performance, video, sculpture, and drawings that use images, particularly those of stuffed bunnies, puppets, costumes, and more, to disarm the viewer and engage difficult emotional and social terrain. So, without further ado, I'd like to turn to Nayland now and ask about this work and others related to it. This work was not included in either presentation of the exhibition, but it is a pivotal and important work. And it's a remarkable encapsulation of so many of the ideas that are at play in your early work between 1987 and 1990. This is the Restraint Chair, which uses the minimalist vocabulary subverted through the use of equipment associated with BDSM. There are a few different bodies of work that emerged during this time. The restraint works, like mirror restraint and restraint device number 1, single restraint, all of which are included in the MIT presentation. The devices like devices for burning bees and sugar and the sod burnt tea set pictured here. And the workstations like Workstation Baby Baby and Workstation 5. So my question, Nayland, is how did all of this work begin for you and working in this particular way?
Um, Hi, everybody. Hello. Let me just say a couple of quick thank yous. Thank you, Jamillah, and thank you, Selby. Thank you, everyone at the list and at the ICA. It is a lot to look through all of this, but I guess to quickly get to the question, I think one of the things that is a through line in all of the work that I've made is that I'm very interested in looking at the things that I encounter in my everyday life and seeing what happens, asking what happens when I change the context of them. And so one thing that sort of struck me as we were looking through the work at the List Center a little while ago is that I realized that much of this work was first shown in a gallery called Media in San Francisco and south of Market. And a lot of the things that made up the pieces were also things that were for sale at other shops in south of Market. That were so the restraints, as you see here, like the clothes racks, that these were things that were that if you were walking around those streets, you could see them in another store just a couple of blocks away. And so that idea of why does this thing function in this context and not in another context, or why do we regard it as a certain way in one context and not another, is something that was continually puzzling to me. But also in thinking about the Restraint Chair, I was thinking about the fact that that the design language of modernist furniture as expressed in this Breuer chair was the same design philosophy that existed in bondage material, right? So it was the idea of the Bauhaus idea that that a good design for a chair should suggest its function and no more. Was something that is the same when you're designing a set of cuffs. And then there's also, for that particular piece, a sort of anecdotal genesis for it, which is that at a certain point, I was able to interview the artist Tom of Finland for a queer publication. And Tom came to San Francisco and was staying and was going to be at a reception at the home of a very wealthy San Francisco leather queen. And so I went to this very fancy person's house who was like the owner of one of San Francisco's leather shops. And there in this apartment was the most insane interior design that I'd ever seen. Like these really like elaborate interior designs, including Breuer chairs, like originals, not knockoffs, like the one in my piece. And it sort of cracked me up, this like sort of high modernist look with also this super serious leather community. And so all of that stuff sort of came together and collided to make that piece, and it opened the door for me to think about a lot of other ideas about functionalism and what it means to eroticize pose and other things like that.
The work also, in addition to like this idea of function and the form of it, I think of like Soylent Green and the reference to certain bodies as furniture that were moved around and used in certain ways. the work and this whole series of work at this earlier point in your career invites another reading altogether. This idea of dueling definitions of bondage, both sexual bondage and of course human bondage or slavery, and also the experience of hypervisibility and being a marked body of some kind that's on display and is in these different transactions. At this point, were you considering this read through the lens of race and history? Was this of interest to you?
Not yet. But I was very much thinking about the sort of bondage equipment in relationship to sculpture. Mm-hmm. That in a way, to have an interest in sexual bondage is to eroticize a pose, and the restraint pieces, because you can mentally try them on yourself, they suggest an arrangement of a body, and they suggest they suggest an activity, and it was after. So in a way, they're armatures, mm-hmm. For sculptures, and it was after thinking about that for a while, really for years, that I began to then ask myself the question of, okay, so where does my interest in this come from? Like, where does a potential interest in being reduced to a piece of furniture come from? And what are the historical and racial valences for that, right? I do believe that one of the things we do with sexuality is to process trauma. That it is not the same thing as therapy, but that it is a way of enunciating our traumas and fears and articulating them, bringing them into the world, and then through working with them, working through them. So at a certain point, I began to ask, I noticed that there's a lot of chains in the work. So what does it mean for a descendant of slaves to have all of these images of chains? And that's when then I started to be more conscious about my deployment of them, right? I mean, this piece, Workstation Baby Baby, is, roofing tar. And so the idea of tarring, or sort of, public humiliation and torture, is a whole other, range for this work that wasn't necessarily there in the earlier pieces. But I think that's one of the things that's powerful to me about actually making objects, is that once you've made the object, you can then go back to it and interrogate it for additional meanings.
Got it. So after this period, which gained considerable attention, you made a departure into using softer materials, shifting away from the hardness of the leather and steel of the previous works to one of a more delicate sensibility, the use of silk flowers, beads, and other decorative materials. So at this point, what was going on for you, and what precipitated this turn?
I think that once I find myself defined in a certain way, I start to chafe against that definition. So I became known as like the stainless steel guy, right? And that all of the work was like super scary, and I started to become really interested in, okay, how can I complicate this definition, right? How can I complicate this reception? And also, I was trained really by artists with very formal concerns and not necessarily narrative concerns. And so I started to think about, like, okay, how can I deal with line in a sculpture? How can I deal with color and fragility? And I think also the thing with the artificial flowers is that one of the things that starts to enter the work at this time is a concern with artifice and representation. And it's very interesting to me that these silk flowers are there as a kind of stand-in for something else, but yet they are actual objects that have mass and shape and color, and that our mind sort of flipping back and forth between the actual reality of the thing that's in front of us and some sort of representational order that it is presenting us with. To me, that has a relationship to ideas about authenticity and how we encounter each other, and my own presentation of as authentic or inauthentic, real or artificial. And so that's been the sort of vaulting of artifice and persona is something that has been tied to a notion of queer aesthetics for, at least since the late 19th century. And so in some ways it's kind of embracing that.
Yeah, there's also this other impression of the work. There's a couple of series around this period, like hysterical arrangements and also the work Magic, where there is this preservation, not just of what the viewer might be seeing, but also of a memory of an idea. And encasing those, like the use of the bell jars for the hysterical arrangement pieces, or like the actual physical ventriloquist dummy case that Madam's encased in for Magic.
Yeah, I mean, this is also, deeply in the midst of the AIDS epidemic, and so ideas about sort of safety and medical distress and mourning and elegiac work were very much in the air at that time. Another artist who was hugely important to me is Ree Morton, whose work really also touches on a lot of these same ideas, a lot of use of flower imagery and a kind of turn to the femme. And so, it seemed, I felt also sort of drawn to that in the midst of, again, being perceived as this sort of like butch, scary type.
So around this time, your work was included into landmark exhibitions, which continue to be the topic of vigorous debate for their examination of culture and politics of their time, which still, of course, is very much current in this moment. The 1993 Whitney Biennial and Black male representations of masculinity in contemporary American art. Shortly thereafter, you produced an exhibition for Matthew Marks called the Black White Album, which debuted sculptures like a Beji, which is included in the MIT show, which makes specific reference to African sculptural and spiritual traditions, as well as the Western sculptural canon, so people like Joseph Beuys and Joseph Cornell, and also this body of work, the Bunny Group series of drawings, which were approximately 80 drawings, including these two sets, such as The Grind, and After the Turner Diaries, which is, of course, a reference to the book that's become a Bible of sorts for the white supremacist movement. Here you are beginning to really actively incorporate the imagery of the bunny, modeled after the Brer Rabbit and other touchstones, and it's become a hallmark of your work. So question is about how long were you at work on this series, and would you consider this body of work a major turning point in the work?
The bunny imagery started showing up in the early 90s, but it really wasn't until I would say like 97 that I really returned to drawing in a big way. And for a couple of reasons. One, I had just moved back to New York and didn't have a studio, and was pretty broke, and drawings were a thing that I could make cheaply in my living room. But also, I sort of got over the fact of I had a certain facility in drawing all through high school, and at one point wanted to be a professional cartoonist. Used to draw comics with my friends and like make zines out of comics, and so I had an ability to draw that I grew to distrust through my training. And again, it was because it came kind of easily to me, so it felt like it was sort of inauthentic. And around this time, I started really feeling like, okay, well, the truth is that I was really raised by Looney Tunes. I was really like every day I would sit in front of the TV and watch Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck, and so the ideas that I have about my own life and my own and race and my own identity come as much from that as they do from anything else. And so since that's the imagery that populates my head, how do I explore that imagery? And so I got over the fact that I could make a lot of different types of drawings and just said, okay, I'm just going to make a lot of different types of drawings. That's kind of the way that I do it. And this format of kind of grouping them together in a way made them into comic strips. Mm-hmm. And so it's like each drawing started to become like a panel, in a comic strip. And so that was a big shift for me, finally letting go of that idea that I had to have what I had been trained to think was an authentic mark on a drawing, helped me really make the drawings into a kind of conduit for my own consciousness.
And the drawings, of course, are such a major part of your work now, since you have a very active drawing practice, and that's reflected in part in the exhibition with a number of drawings that we included. I'd like to talk a little bit about your performance for video, where this embodiment of another physical form or state of consciousness comes into play. Each of the videos, in one way or another, have a form of visual comedy, even though there is some stress or excess that is unfolding on screen. So Gorge, which is the image here, is the most direct representation of your own body, with the visual relationship between your body and the feeder's body, opening up a really stark and complicated negotiation of power. In the scene, there's also Negative Bunny, where you provide the voice of a rather persistent and increasingly stressed bunny rabbit. And then starting over, which I'll play a short clip from, where the costume that you're wearing bears the physical weight of your partner, Philip Horvitz, and you're actually wearing that on your back and performing as directed to the point of exhaustion. So I'm going to play a little clip now, if my computer will cooperate. And let these come out. Okay, we're going to go pull down. Keep the eyes more in front of you. Okay. Keep that. What initially attracted you to performance as a possible means of producing your work? And what do you think it offers you more so than objects may not?
Well, you know, as with so many of these things, I had, it's something that I had sort of done off and on all the way through, but never, but rarely focused attention on it. So, um, you know, I used to do performances in the late 80s that were me doing kind of dramatic readings of texts that I made up through collage, um, and uh, and and then those started to um, turn into these more, I guess I would say, endurance based pieces. But each one of these pieces, each one of the video pieces, with the exception of Negative Bunny, is really documenting a kind of interpersonal interaction between myself and someone else, and in a way they are all um, presentations of what could be called like S&M scenes.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, in talking about BDSM, one of the things that I've said in the past is that it's a performance form where the audience and the performers are the same people, and they are making a kind of meaning together. So these videos aren't quite that, but they are an attempt to talk about, particularly in Starting Over, what it means to make art as part of a couple. And it's something that I feel like contemporary art rarely addresses. It's more usually you get like a solo performer. So this piece, Starting Over, is titled after a song from John Lennon and Yoko Ono's album Double Fantasy. And the song that that Phil is teaching me the dance to is Michael and Janet Jackson's song Scream. And all of these things to me are models of coupledom, and models of collaboration, that are both intense, but also not entirely benign.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So the question about who's in control is always foregrounded in these pieces, and particularly in the live versions of Gorge that I've done subsequent to the video. The setup is that I'm in front of the audience and I will eat what the audience feeds me for an hour. And my affect is quite blank. And really it becomes about the audience putting on a show for each other. Everybody comes up with their own little way of how they're going to feed me. And so I think a lot about, in performance, and obviously Gorge owes a great debt to Yoko Ono's cut piece. But I think that the performance for me is about highlighting the performative situation as being one that is never passive in any direction. That it is something that the performer and the audience does together. That they make that happen. And helping people to actually feel that, as opposed to ignoring it, I think is the thing that is exciting to me about performances.
And it opens up this other conversation, the giving over of control in the situations in your video, even though you are the maker of the video. So you're setting up the conditions in a way, but then completely kind of giving away of that and allowing your body to be used in different ways. So I want to go back a little bit to the bunny iconography and the use of surrogates, which is connected again to this, the performance work that you've been doing and how your body becomes a tool for some other form of action. So you began using the bunny imagery in the 90s, the early 90s, and expanded the use of this idea of the surrogate or the avatar to soft ambiguous forms that you've called mopes, which are seen in this slide here. And then also to puppets and marionettes, such as the Philosopher's Suite marionettes, one of which is in the foreground of this slide at the MIT List Center. And then the replica of Madam from Wayland Flowers and Madam, the stars of Hollywood Squares and many other programs that features in your work Magic. And you also use costumes quite extensively, such as those in Equipment for a Shameful Epic, which is in the background, and many other examples that are on view in the exhibition. So we've talked a little bit about the decision to use this strategy of the surrogate as an act of revealing or concealing one's true self and hiding what might lurk underneath the surface. So this connects to how one presents themselves and the ambiguity that can prevail. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about using toys and how that came about and how that continues to be a useful strategy for you.
Sure. I think that you know, in the past decade, I feel like you know, a big influence on my thinking was the psychologist Winnicott. Who writes a lot about early child development and particularly talks about toys as transitional objects. I always call myself a sculptor because I am really interested in physicality and objecthood. And yet we have so many of these categories of objects that we ascribe personality to, or that seem to have a level of agency above and beyond their simple utility. And so that takes many forms, and it exists in a lot of different cultures. But the idea of a puppet or a toy as a sort of third term of subjecthood that is neither me nor you, but is something that we sort of agree together exists in a certain way with a certain personality. That to me seems like a really interesting and kind of unexplored class of object. And yet it's one that we encounter all the time. And so for me, magic is both a kind of you know, memorial piece to Wayland Flowers, but also a kind of musing on the ways that only a certain kind of puppet could enable his stardom, and Madam enabled his stardom at the expense of turning him into the straight man. You know, she's the one who told the jokes, and one of the things that was uncanny about after winning her at the auction and having her in my studio was that a number of us sort of tried her on, and we could all do the gestures, but none of us could do the voice. And there's something that I almost felt a little fearful of, like, if one of us actually were able to make the voice happen, you know, what personality could awaken there. And so, you know, in a way, she's an amazing object of queer culture, because she marks the way that only certain types of personalities were allowed to be visible in mainstream culture, and up to a certain point. And that's where the name comes from. The name comes from the William Golding novel and the film starring Anthony Hopkins that was made of it.
Which we've never talked about. It's one of my favorite movies.
Really?
Yeah, it's one of my favorite movies.
I you know, I just always assume that people know, but of course it's kind of an obscure movie now. But it's a movie about, like, a ventriloquist comedian trying to maintain his own sense of self and when confronted with a sort of dominant personality in the form of his ventriloquist dummy. So yes, we will. Yay! I'm so glad we have more conversations to talk. It is an amazing movie. If those of you in the audience who haven't seen it, well worth taking a look at.
Yes. Yeah. For fans of Anthony Hopkins and Margaret and evil ventriloquist dummies.
Yes. If you want to, if you want to see Anthony Hopkins pre Hannibal Lecter, like if you want to see sweaty, out of control Anthony Hopkins,
that's the movie for you.
This is the movie to go see.
Yeah. Okay. So the most recent example of a use of costume related to these ideas is Crossing Object Inside Nomen, which you produced in 2017. How has this idea of the surrogate evolved for you recently, especially considering how the world has changed so much due to social media, fandoms, and online communities?
Well, the thing that I find irritating about the art world as we experience it is that so often it problematizes things that other people are already exploring more fully. And I'm a big believer in go to where the experts are. So one of the things that is amazing to me about the furry fandom is that it is a cultural community where people are able to explore the possibilities of different bodies and different different presentations through a sort of consensual fantasy and community of cultural makers. So you know, that ability to imagine the body that you might desire to have, and to have that body change over time, and to find people who were willing to make art about that body and agree to that appearance is a remarkably unalienated relationship to gender and presentation. And that's happening in an online community that has a robust commissioning and art creating part of it that has nothing to do with galleries and museums. I mean, it has a tiny bit to do with it now because I included some of it in my ICA show.
Yes.
But I included it as an example of, like, this is where people are getting their needs met. And that's powerful. We tend to talk about the internet as being a profoundly alienating experience, which it is in many ways. But then you have communities where young, queer, trans people are able to explore the the possibilities of all of the different ways that they might want to exist in the world, and to find common cause around that. That's a really remarkable use of the medium. And so I grew up as a science fiction and fantasy fan, reading a lot of comic books, looking at a lot of sci-fi movies and stuff, and then left the organized fandom, um, in the early 70s because of its homophobia and misogyny and that I was sort of encountering there. And it's been one of the great pleasures of my life that I've been able to live long enough to see a sort of burgeoning, queer, multiracial fandom rise in a lot of different places, and it happened because it happened online.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing how separate we are, geographically, but can converge and have space together and, inspire each other, educate each other through the space of the internet. So it's been really interesting to make connections in that way to your work that you've been doing for some time, which is really invested in the various communities that you participate in and that have deeply influenced your work. Thinking about the dust flag, which is a reference to the stud in San Francisco, the pipe route, the double-sided pipe, which is a part of, the bear, a subset of the bear community, and smoking, the interest in smoking, and Ruins of a Sensibility, which is the record collection, which very exciting that it is in the galleries at MIT right now, which is your record collection from 1972 to 2002, as well as Nomen and the video Stab, which is this is a still of. As well as this last work, which is my last slide, of a work from 2018, which connects really to your interest in crafting and this crafting community that you're also participating in. So I wonder, as a last question before we turn to Q&A, if you didn't have these interests and influences, as diverse as they are, how different do you think your work would be?
I mean, I don't think I would have work. To me, the making of the work is the way that I puzzle through the interests. It is it is the result of me putting something together and then going like, why did I think that was appropriate together? Why did I think why do I think that these things belong together? And then starting to research and thinking about other places that I saw things together, other points of connection, and so it's I want us to be able to revel in our complexities, and I think that art is the place where we can do it, even though that often makes people anxious because they want one solid answer. And the thing that I try to say to people when they're looking at my work is, there's no way to get it wrong. Whatever you're thinking about it is what you're thinking about it, right? There are no wrong holes. Just keep it. It's thrilling to me that someone will see something and then see something else years down the road and connect those two things, because that's the way that my mind works. And I think it's the way that thought continues to live in the culture.
And it is something about you that I'm deeply grateful for, as we've come together to make this show. So thank you so much for everything, Nayland.
Well, thank you. I mean, I'm crabby about the art world a lot, but the fact that you get to make friends, like the idea that that through this process we've been able to become friends means a huge amount to me.
Same, for sure. forever. So Selby, I'm going to punt it to you for Q&A.
Yeah, thank you both so much. It's amazing that I've seen you speak a number of times now about your work, the two of you as interlocutors, and it always uncovers something different. So I think that just really speaks to how rich Nayland your work is, and also Jamillah, like how closely you know it and have attended to it. So thank you. So I'm not going to ask any questions myself, but I thought I would just read out a few from the Q&A box here. So I believe this question is from Thor Stockman, who says, Nayland, you briefly spoke about revisiting and reconsidering earlier works, seeing them in new and different perspectives. Have you ever revisited an earlier work or withdrawn it from consideration to be included in a retrospective show, for instance, and this is me adding this one.
Hi, Thor. I just quickly, I will say yes. There's a piece that was included in the last sort of semi-retrospective grouping in New York about a decade ago that we kind of consciously decided not to include in this iteration of the show. And I think that there's a period in the work where I was really trying to articulate what internalized racism looks like as a person who grew up and continues to live in a racist society, and yet as a Black person, my own thinking is entangled with racist imagery, and there was some work that I made trying to articulate that, and last year Jamillah and I looked at it and it was like, this is really not the right time to display this. Like it's not. It's you know.
And it was even before this moment, and
even before this moment, it was
summer,
just sort of like I'm not interested in. I'm not interested in showing that right now.
There's some objects that, there's some things, some references that, there is a strategy of recuperation and trying to rethink an image that is super potent and means a lot of things to a lot of people. And there's some images that are just irredeemable. And the Confederate flag is one of those things.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm gonna ask another question.
Sure.
That's okay. Are you?
Yeah.
Sure.
No, that was good.
It's always weird with these Zoom things. Hard
Yes.
to read the room. So from Janet Lauren Hill asks to Nayland also, having a tendency to reinvent yourself and live in a fluid material space as a maker, did you ever find it challenging for curators to follow your progression from series to series? And if so, how did you contend with this?
Yeah. I've always looked at every show that I've done as the opportunity to give people more information than they had before. And to me, that's what having a career really means. It's about continually expanding your thought. I think that I think that people have to do a lot of filing rapidly. So they like to put you in a particular file, and they get agitated and distressed when you present them with work that isn't part of that file. the way that I've dealt with it is to wait around for the people who really get it. So that's, that is the core of my gratitude for both of you that I'm working with, is that you really got it. It's why I'm, it's so glad to have worked with Ian Barry and with Nora Riley. It's like, you wait for the folks who love you for you and for what you do, not the fact that you were able to make something that seemed very timely at one point. So I think you have to think about what is the sort of legacy that you want to leave. And for me, it's always been about leaving people with a lot of different stuff that they can dig around and root around in and find interesting things the further they go into it, rather than having a show that they could look at and get it and then walk away from it and not think about it ever again.
And I have a question from Rag for Jamillah, which I think kind of maybe relates.
Hi, Rag.
Hi.
So Rag asks, as a curator, was there anything that stood out in Nayland's body of work that seemed to be unique in their archive, something that differentiates them from other artists? And what was there a work that you wish you could have included in the show but were unable to? I think I know the answer to that, but I will let you answer it.
When I first came to Nayland's work, it was twofold. It was a Brooklyn Rail interview that happened a number of years ago with Jared Ernest. And it was at the time that I was at the Studio Museum as a fellow and just snooping around in the collection, and then connecting the dots between the work that I saw, the Diagram of the Heavens, and what I was reading about Nayland, and how the thing that's really appealing to me of many things about the work is how concise the work is. Even though it has its messiness, it has, a bunch of different directions that it can point to. The packing in of so much identity, both queer and racial identity, thinking about a history of racial terror and violence in this country, thinking about just the ways that we move in the world and the different things that impact our lived experience, and encapsulating that into like a neat object, be it, a rod with handcuffs or a stuffed animal that is doing something completely unexpected. Those were things that were really appealing to me about it. And also just the consistency of Nayland's work over the years and just how good everything is. I mean, I'm not just saying this because we're here together, Nayland, but it's true. I've spent a lot of time with the work, and there are so many things that I wanted to include in the show, but for space and other considerations, just we couldn't. And one of those pieces is, of course, the Restraint Chair, which we talked about, but that got a lot of shine time in the Stonewall exhibition. So it's really, I'm glad that the show was able to, that show was on, while ours was on, and people could also see that object. But there's a lot, hundreds of objects that are really fantastic that we just couldn't include, or we couldn't find. It's just one of those things. Making a survey show is a very complex thing, and there's a lot of things that are at play. But I think we did capture a pretty accurate picture of the practice. Thinking about behavior, and that at that time being a 30-year survey, and then kind of moving forward from that to this moment, and this also being a 30-year survey, there's a lot of ground to cover. But I think we've done a good job. There's always going to be things that keep me up at night, like, oh, I should have included that. But that's just curators being curators. I'll just leave it there. I think you know what I mean.
I think we have time for like 2 more questions.
Okay.
A little bit past 7:30. Nayland, I have a question from Nick Elliott. who writes, talking about how S&M scenes are a sort of performance art with someone. Did you feel that some aspect of your performance work or art was also about humiliation play?
Hi, Nick. I think the real question is like, what aspect isn't? I mean, there is, I think that the thing that is such a powerful dynamic for all of us is the desire to be seen, and humiliation is a type of play that you know, balances the desire to be seen with the anxiety of being seen, the anxiety of being seen and rejected. And so I think you know, if you want to feel humiliated, have a retrospective. There's a lot of stuff that you know, I'm walking through like, oh my God, oh, they're gonna see that. Well, there's that. So I think that's why I say that there isn't a distinction between, you know, my sexual interests and my artistic interests. I think that those things are the same thing. They're the way that we make meaning out of the emotions that we have around experiences. And some of it happens in a space that we call a studio, and some of it happens in a place that we call a bedroom, or we call a dungeon, or something like that. But we are always struggling to find meaning and understanding in the things that we feel compelled to do.
Nayland, I remember the first time that I had the opportunity to visit with you, you and I talked about the dungeon and the studio being the same thing. So it's nice to hear that come back again.
Mm-hmm.
We're a little bit over time, but do we want to do one more question, or yeah, one more?
Sure.
Yeah, one more.
Yeah. Let's do one more.
Because this is a one that I'm interested to hear the answer from Jonathan Payne, who wonders if, Nayland, you could speak a little bit about the relationship between drawing and performance in your work. They elaborate beyond a reification of subject matter, for example, the bunny suit and the bunny characters. How else do these particular disciplines cross-pollinate psychically for you?
I think that the drawings point the way towards types of objects that I might be interested in making, and vice versa. I think that those many of the sort of wire and bead pieces came about after I started making much more delicate drawings, for example. So they became a way of sort of thinking about a type of line, or a different way of using space. And also drawing is a really good way for me to sort of catalog my reactions to a particular idea. The other thing that I will say is that in the case of Gnomon, for example, my persona, one of the things I do is I commission other artists to make art about art using them as a character. So there's a way that there's a whole life of that character that is that is based in drawing that I don't even do. You know, and that is I think a really interesting new sort of hybridization of a subject that exists in the intersections of many different pieces of art, rather than just in one. And so that's another way that drawing is kind of, moving back and forth in those things.
Okay. I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Jamillah. Thank you, Nayland. And thanks to all of you who asked questions. I'm sorry that we weren't unable to answer them all in time, and thanks for attending. And please stay tuned for updates following in the new year as to whether or not the List Center can open. Will be, well, whether or not we're able to open. So we will be posting about that on our website and social media. Thank you all.
And thank you, Selby. Thank you.
Yes.
And thank you to everyone at MIT for hosting this show. It's been a pleasure. And thank you, Nayland.
And thank you all.
Bye, everyone.
Good night.
Good night,
Thank
folks.
you, everyone.